Hi, I'm Jackie Zions from Equine Guelph, and today I have with me Dr. Wendy Pearson, Associate Professor at the University of Guelph. We're going to discuss leaky gut syndrome in horses and a potential new supplement that may influence gut barrier function. Welcome back for another video chat, Dr. Pearson.
Thanks so much, Jackie.
So let's get into it. What exactly is leaky gut syndrome in horses, and how does it compare to what we know about the condition in humans or other animals?
Boy, that's a great question. And the reason it's such a great question is because it has a very unsatisfactory answer. And that is that from the equine perspective, we don't actually know very much about leaky gut syndrome. What we do know about it, we actually glean from information that we know in humans and other species. So, in kind of a high level nutshell, basically what's happening is that there are little sort of gaps in the gut, which in a healthy gut stay closed. And we call these tight junctions. And what these tight junctions do is they ensure that material that's in the GI tract moves through, and anything that's potentially toxic or non-nutritive or non-digestible ends up in the manure. Now you can imagine if that barrier between the inside of the GI tract and the body is breached in some way, and you start having leakage of compounds that are in the gut moving up into the bloodstream that really shouldn't be there, that can actually cause some problems. And some of the sort of the clinical signs that are sometimes attributed to leaky gut syndrome in horses is a low grade systemic inflammation that can manifest in things like allergies, performance problems, osteoarthritic problems, those kinds of kind of chronic inflammation associated problems. Oftentimes, when we don't have really any other clue as to why the horse is experiencing these clinical signs, then it can sometimes be attributed to leaky gut. But in terms of what we know specific to horses, there's really very little. We have actually three publications in the scientific literature, two of which are research studies on leaky gut, and the third is actually a review that came out of North Carolina State University, that's actually reviewing what's known in non-equine species, really just to make the point, hey, we really should be worried about this in horses. Um, so yeah, so that's kind of at this point where we move forward in our research of leaky gut in horses with a baseline that we think, okay, there must be some similarities between what we see in humans and non-equines, and that's kind of where we start.
Why do you think leaky gut has remained such an under-researched area in equine health, despite all the health implications that you were just mentioning?
Yeah, and that's another great question because I think prior to the state of knowledge that we're at, we didn't have the tools to really be able to measure things like function of tight junction proteins, and a lot of this is fairly new knowledge that's coming on board. And the other obvious sort of situation is that a horse can't tell us what the horse is experiencing, whereas a human can. So the vast majority of information that we have on leaky gut is actually what we know in humans. Ironically, it's actually athletic humans that we have a lot of information about leaky gut, as well as humans that have problems like irritable bowel and colitis. There seems to be a connection there with leaky gut as well. So I think that's really what it is that we don't, up until fairly recently, we haven't had the tools to really be able to measure the impact of leaky gut, as well as to relate some of the clinical signs directly to that leaky gut. So we're in a very early stage of knowledge in this area.
You've said before that the gut is a critical player in immune responses and in inflammation. Can you elaborate on how gut health influences overall health in horses?
Boy, there's nothing more important to a horse than a healthy gut. It's literally that simple. Even you take it from the level of the microbiome, right? The microbiome participates intimately in immune response. I mean, you imagine all of those things that come from the outside of the horse into the horse's mouth and then into the gut. So many of those things that are getting consumed are potentially immunogenic. So there is a vast sort of a, how do you say, like an immune responding microbiome that makes sure that those pathogens stay within the gut and then ultimately come out in the manure. There are also very complex interactions between the material that's in the GI tract and the interface of the gut. So if you remove the ability of that interface to be able to effectively filter what's in the gut and what is ultimately allowed to come into the bloodstream, boy, that's a potentially devastating problem. Now, the kind of the good thing, if I can say, about leaky gut is that typically the clinical signs of leaky gut tend to be kind of low grade and chronic. They're not typically seen as something that's very acute and a medical emergency. So from that perspective, we're sort of in good shape, because a lot of times when you have these chronic kind of low grade type problems, a lot of times it gets kind of, if I can say, blamed on leaky gut, because just by order of elimination, right? The vet's eliminated any other possible cause. So then leaky gut ends up being something that is potentially a candidate. But yeah, the gut in terms of its role in immune function is essential. So it's something that must be protected. And the other reason is it must be, we really need to learn a lot more about leaky gut in horses, because if we are putting horses in a situation where they're prone to developing leaky gut, that has major implications on immune response.
How do factors like stress, diet, medications like NSAIDs contribute to increased gut permeability in horses?
Well, we don't know a lot about that. There's a master's thesis came out of Michigan State University, and that student was looking at the effect of nonsteroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, phenylbutazone in particular, on development of leaky gut in horses. And what they found is that the administration of NSAIDs increased development of gastric ulceration in these horses and increased leaky gut. So the problem with that is we don't know, was it the NSAID that caused the leaky gut, or was it the NSAID that caused the ulcers that caused the leaky gut? So we don't really have a cause effect per se, but we do have an association. So that's one of the few things that we do know is associated with development of leaky gut in horses. Something else that we do know in two of the very few studies we have in the literature is that transport stress followed by moderate intensity exercise is sufficient to increase permeability of the gut. Now, whether we can really say that, well, then exercise maybe contributes to leaky gut, I'm not sure we can go that far, because what we saw when we had this model where we stressed horses with transport stress followed by exercise, the permeability of the gut went up, but then it came back down again. So I think where we have a bigger problem is when you have chronic stressors that have a more sustained or persistent effect on gut permeability. So, I'm not comfortable yet to say that exercise contributes to leaky gut, but exercise does contribute to gastrointestinal hyperpermeability for a short period of time. Now, what happens when you have these exercise bouts that are piled on top of each other day after day? Is that sufficient to create more leaky gut? I don't know. We haven't done the research. The other question is the exercise-induced leaky gut influenced by how fit the horse is, right? When we stress these sedentary horses, then these guys for sure had a leaky gut effect. So what this really illustrates is that we don't really know very much about what causes leaky gut in horses. What causes leaky gut in humans, if we look at the human literature and the relationship between fitness and development of gastrointestinal hyperpermeability and leaky gut syndrome in humans, is that the more fit the human is, there is a positive association between fitness and leaky gut, which means the more elite athletes actually have a more pronounced gastrointestinal response to exercise compared with less fit humans. So, how does that translate to horses? Your guess is as good as mine. That being said, we do have a research project starting literally with a matter of days that we're gonna ask that question of our research horses, and we're gonna see, how that transpires at the end of the summer.
How are researchers currently diagnosing leaky gut in horses?
Um, well, I think the question really isn't necessarily whether they're diagnosing leaky gut. As a researcher, I mean, vets presumably are diagnosing leaky gut, and I can't speak to the vet side because I'm not a vet. But what researchers do is we want to be able to measure it, right? It's not necessarily diagnosing a disease, but it's measuring a physiological condition. So there are a number of ways that different researchers have done this. Some use a type of sugar that when you feed it to the horse, this is a sugar that's not typically found in the horse's feed. And when that sugar reaches the GI tract, it starts to move into the blood. And the thing about this sugar is the molecule is actually quite large and it doesn't get absorbed by the same mechanism as, say, glucose, for example. So in a healthy GI tract, when you provide this sugar, most of it should stay in the GI tract. But when you stress the horse and open up those tight junctions, then this sugar can leak out of the blood leak out of the GI tract into the blood and can then be measured. So that's one way we can measure it. There are other researchers that use radioactive isotopes. So they'll actually tag a molecule with a radioisotope. And then by the same kind of philosophy, that molecule normally would not move through the tight junctions until there is some kind of a compromise. And then you can measure this radioactivity in blood. Now, what we use in our lab when we're measuring leaky gut is we use a compound called iohexol. And iohexol is a contrast agent that's used in pediatric medicine. So it's extremely safe and it's essentially a completely inert molecule. But the reason it's really useful for us is that its molecular size is just a little bit too big to fit through a healthy tight junction. So when we open up those tight junctions, in our case, we've done it with transport, stress, and exercise, then we can measure as iohexol leaks out of the gut into the blood. So that's the model that we typically use to measure leaky gut.
Your upcoming research, as you said, days away, is on sprouted hemp seed meal. What makes this supplement a promising candidate for supporting gut health in horses?
Yeah, this is an interesting product. We do a lot of work with sort of refined nutraceutical products. This product is a little bit of a step back from that, or step sideways. I don't know if it's backwards or forwards, but it's just not quite there. And the reason I say that is it looks more like a whole food, like a feed that you might feed in relatively larger quantities than some of these sort of supplement type products. And for that reason, personally, I find it super interesting because it's a very nutrient dense product. The sprouting process really influences in a very positive way the nutritional profile of this product. And it's been looked at in a number of different species in beef cow, for example, and in other species whereby it modifies the microbiome in the GI tract to and of course the microbiome is the first line of defense for these tight junctions. So if you can feed something that will positively impact the microbiome profile, that will presumably help protect those tight junctions. But the other interesting thing about this sprouted hemp seed meal is we've actually been doing some work with this product in the research lab, and we're looking at it from an anti-inflammatory perspective. And it seems to have some pretty interesting anti-inflammatory effects as well. So when you couple that together with its impact on the microbiome, I think potentially we have something that can make a really meaningful impact on leaky gut syndrome in horses.
How might your research on leaky gut change the way we manage equine nutrition, medication, and training?
Well, it's so interesting because recently, in the last couple of years, I've had a real interest in leaky gut. And I once had a proposal that was reviewed, and the review came back and said, well, how is this useful? Because what are we going to do? Just not exercise our horses? So what difference does it make if they have a leaky gut or not? And I think that's profoundly short-sighted. We have to have this information, not because, if we find out that horses, when they're exercising, they do experience leaky gut, it doesn't mean we stop exercising them. It means we're now informed. So now we need to start looking at products like this product from Canerta, whereby we can alter our management so that we can best set the horse up for success. If we, by our management choices, we're predisposing these horses to developing these subclinical inflammatory conditions, this is information we need to have, right, in order for us to responsibly manage our horses. So I think those are some of we are at an early stage in this research, and this is all about information. We need information so that we can take that information and use it for education, and it's the education ultimately that's going to transform our management around the new knowledge that we generate.
So, do you foresee a future where gut health becomes a central focus in equine preventative care and in performance optimization?
I mean, I think we're there already, actually. Gut health is widely recognized as one of the key, it's a foundation of a healthy animal, a healthy horse, right? I mean, you don't have to look any further than, the number one killer of horses outside of old age. What is that? Well, it's gut problems, colic,
Yeah.
right? And, is there a relationship between leaky gut and colic? Maybe, maybe not. But that's information we should have. So I think, yes, I think we're there now, and it's going to persist in the future, because if it doesn't, we're going to start to see a lot heavier welfare burden, a lot heavier economic burden on horses that are experiencing these problems that we don't have the information to properly manage.
How can horse owners and veterinarians stay proactive about gut health while the science continues to evolve?
I always lean on the best information that we have at the time. So I think the best that we can do right now is to follow some fundamental principles of maintaining gut health. So those principles: make sure your horse has a healthy forage-based diet. Make sure that diet is balanced for the nutrients that horse needs for the stage of life he is at. And make sure the horse has sufficient turnout. And by sufficient, I mean ideally 24/7. And I acknowledge a personal bias here, but that personal bias is based on objective information. That is the best thing we can do to keep our horse's gut health as sound as possible. And then beyond that, I think when we start generating this new knowledge, then that's when we can start to say, okay, how does that interface with the knowledge we already have? And so how do we need to alter our management to incorporate this new knowledge?
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Wendy. We look forward to following this research.
Thank you so much, Jackie.